Dollars to Donuts with your host, Steve Portugal.
Greetings and thanks for checking out this episode of Dollars to Donuts, a podcast where I talk with people who lead user research in their organization. Coming up in San Francisco on September 13th, I'm teaching a public workshop, Fundamentals of Interviewing Users. I'll put the link in the show notes. I bet you know someone in the San Francisco Bay Area who would get value out of this workshop, and I'd appreciate you recommending it. Also, I work with organizations directly to help them elevate their user research practices. Of course, supporting me in my business is the best way for you to support this podcast and help me make more episodes. If you have thoughts about the podcast, reach out to me at donuts@portugal.com or on Twitter at Dollars to Donuts. That's DOLLRSTODONUTS. I went to a cafe in my neighborhood. I placed my order and then I swiped my card in the payment terminal and they told me, "We'll call you when your order is ready." So I went and sat down. I heard a couple of orders get called double cappuccino, soy milk latte, etc. And after a few minutes, they called me, "Steve." I was briefly taken aback. They never asked me for my name. How did they know that order was for me? I realized that when I paid for my order by credit card, of course they got my name. But this seemed like a new customer service behavior. I was curious, so I paid attention the next time I went to Starbucks. And they asked me for my name. They do this before payment. My local Starbucks is inconsistent as to whether or not they always ask for my name and whether or not they call out my order by the contents of the order or by my name. There are many regular routines that we go through that become almost scripted. So when something goes off script, like being called by name when I was never asked for my name, it really jumps out. Eventually, the script gets rewritten and we regard the change as familiar, but those moments of change are sometimes tentative moments in an experience. This cafe could have asked me for my name, not so they had my name, but so that they could signal to me that they were asking for permission to address me by name in a few minutes. I'm sure there are cases where the name on the credit card doesn't match to how someone prefers to be addressed. Maybe I'm just too sensitive in noticing this change to find it an abrupt surprise, but you can just imagine the well-meaning coffee shop staff feeling excited about being able to do this, to get the customer name and call out the orders in a more personalized manner than just double Americano. I mean, they could, but did anyone stop to think whether or not they should? Note that I'm not complaining about my service experience, just reflecting on it to suggest that it's an interesting moment when things change. Knowing that things are going to change is an opportunity to get ahead of that change and try to understand more deeply from the people who use that service what it is that they are expecting and where there might be mismatches between what you want to do and what that change will mean for these customers. Well, on to the interview. It was wonderful to get to speak with Ruth Ellison, and I think you're going to really like our conversation. She is the head of user research at the Digital Transformation Agency in Australia. Ruth, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Steve. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So why don't we begin, as I often do, as we all often do, I guess, is ask you for an introduction. Tell us, what do you do?
Okay, so hi, my name is Ruth Ellison. I'm the head of user research at the Digital Transformation Agency. So we call it DTA. We love our acronyms in government. So DTA is a small and relatively new government agency set up to actually help Australian government create simple and fast, clear services. So this involves improving the skill sets of people who work in this space, in digital space, and also just looking at projects and how we do digital transformation across government.
So what is digital transformation?
Oh, that's $1 million question.
Do I have to pay $1 million to get the answer?
It's one of those things that we've got a digital transformation strategy. For me, it's really about how are we transforming the way government thinks and approach problems. How do we help our citizens interact with government in ways that are better? So we use digital, but really for me, it's not just about digital. It's about the people, and it's about the services and how we move to a much more human-centered lens to problem solving and problem definition, and even just the way we deliver our services.
And then who are the, I don't know if clients is the right word, but who engage within government?
Yeah, so the DTA has a very interesting function, we're a centralised government agency, very small. It's only a few hundred of us. Our clients are actually other government agencies, mostly at the federal level, because we have 3 levels of government in Australia: federal, state and local. So we work mostly at the federal level, but part of our function is also looking where services cross between boundaries of government and how does that work across. So our clients are mostly at the federal level. The other government agencies, often very, very large or very small, doesn't matter the sizing. What it matters is what are they doing that involves interactions with their users, which is normally citizens or businesses and organisations.
And what are different ways that those relationships get initiated in government?
Yeah, so this is interesting for us. A lot of work comes through depending on the size of the project as opposed to the size of the problem. So the DTA is actually involved in investments that's worth over a certain number of dollars. But we're also interested in projects that have a social impact as well. So if it meets a range of our internal priorities, we're keen to get involved. So anything that really involves a way to transform the way government's interacting with citizens, we're interested in reaching out and working with people. So it's not just government. We also work with government and not-for-profits and other private organisations to work out what's the best way to collaborate and find new ways of working. It's really exciting.
Yeah, can you give some examples over the last few years? What kinds of things the DTA has worked on?
Yeah, so part of our transformation agenda is how do we uplift the skill sets required to work in these ways, and these more human-centred ways. So I've been involved in a few projects back in earlier days of DTA, it's called Digital Transformation Office. One of them was actually around looking at how people, this might sound really boring, but it was fascinating, about tax obligations. So we're looking at the space of how do people start up small businesses and what are the kind of challenges and barriers that they face when interacting with government. So we went through the full discovery process, going through discovery, we do alpha, beta and live. So discovery was really about what is this problem space looking like for starting a business. As government, we have a lot of assumptions around how people interact with us and our role within people's lives. But through a reality discovery, quickly discover that there's a lot of other factors and lots of other interactions that happen that can be quite surprising. Based on that, the team we narrowed down and actually look at this particularly interesting space, like the maker movement, the people who are making a lot of jewellery or they're crafting beers or they're doing very niche kind of things where it's kind of a hobby at the moment, but it starts shifting over into potentially a small business. That space is fraught with a lot of questions and uncertainty from our citizens because they're not sure what happens if I don't say anything to the tax office. Do I get a tax debt down the track? You don't want to end up with a $20,000 debt. It's very scary. How do we actually help solve that particular problem? So through this kind of discovery and alpha processes, we narrowed down and actually helped I think 3 agencies work on this particular problem on how we define what people's obligations are with the government and how we can make that a little bit easier.
So what gets output from that process, and what gets made or implemented by an agency as a result of that kind of program?
So I think people hear the word digital and they tend to assume, is it going to be a digital product? In this case, it was, but some other projects were not. In this particular case, we ended up with a little smart online questionnaire tool set, but we didn't know that was what we were going to have. The team was quite deliberate in starting out very open to work out what is the actual problems and what's the context of these lives that we're trying to understand, because we can't just assume a digital tool is going to solve that particular thing. And it's a bit of a mind shift for government because often it's quicker just to go down and just go, we're going to have an app or a new website to fix this. And part of this way of working is going, actually, is that actually true? Are there other ways we can solve this, and how do we make people's lives easier? So we did end up with a digital thing at the end with this, and it actually crosses over multiple agencies, which for those who don't work in government, it's actually a very challenging space. Agencies tend to work in silos just for the nature of the way we fund projects and the way we work and the way skill sets are built, that it's very siloed into one agency at a time. So to have something that worked across multiple departments and agencies was actually a really amazing achievement, and it was well done to the teams for being part of this process and actually being willing to change as we went along and learn lots of new stuff about our users.
You're talking about the teams in these agencies that are open to that kind of collaboration.
So I think in the earlier days of DTO or DTA, people treated this a bit of an experiment. So what we did was we formed multidisciplinary teams. So we didn't have user research going out, doing research and throwing it over the fence. We're trying to shift that mindset because traditionally a lot of research that happens in government is very much in the evaluative side, where you do a lot of usability testing, you do reports, you kind of give it back to the teams and they do stuff with it and you hope they implement some of it. This was about trying to change the way we approach research, but approach the whole problem landscape. So the team was formed from, I think, 3 or 4 different agencies, including us. I was actually one of the researchers embedded into that particular team at that time. So this was before my head of research job. And then we actually worked with the teams, with developers, business subject matter experts, taxation experts, and my favorite, a lawyer as well, on how we actually tackle this. And the reason we started looking at those kind of skill sets was because we found that we're just doing a very IT-focused problem. We don't then look at the problem from a human lens. It comes down to a very technical solution. So by bringing people like the business folks in and the lawyers, we start having this kind of transformation that occurs that's very different. So some of the lawyers, I was working with her. I remember before she joined the team, she was saying, we have to send stuff up to her team and they'll approve the wording and then we can go out to the users. And it was slowing down the processes of how we're doing design and research. So the team asked her to join our team and she became embedded. And she went from this process of research stuff, that's not really what I do. I'm here to be your taxation expert and your lawyer, the legal expert, to coming on all the research and just changing her mindset on how we actually approach the way we word things. So going from, we can't say that because that's not how government says things, to that's not going to work for the people we saw, was a massive mindset shift, and it was fascinating.
What do you think, how did you create the conditions for her to have that kind of personal, professional transformation? So
that's an interesting question. It really comes down to the whole team. We're very lucky to have a team of people from different agencies who were willing to try these new ways of working. A lot of them had done Agile before, but not necessarily worked where you have all these multiple skill sets in one team embedded for a 20-week process of trying to go through a full discovery all the way up to releasing something. So part of that was we have social contracts in place as a team, and how do we create a safe environment, psychologically safe, that where we can raise things and challenge each other, and it's okay to do that. It was an active work every day. The whole team's working on this kind of ways of working to say it's okay to come along, it's okay to not agree with things, but come along and let's just try having an open mind when we're going out to this research and just observe, and we'll come back. And as a team, we do our analysis and our synthesis together, and that really helped her and other team members' transformation of a mindset because everyone was involved in the process, not just me as a researcher bringing somebody else out with me. Yeah. And I think that was a significant mindset change.
So this group of people, 20 weeks, were like, how big was the team?
Team, I think, we had about 8 to 10. If the size of the team changes, and even now my role as head of research, we help teams to understand that the team does change. The nature of the team changes over the course of these phases. So we kept it small for that particular team because we had to move fairly quickly. We had to deliver something, but we also had to show the teams how we could uplift the kind of capability in both research and the other kind of specialist skill sets. So there was agile skill sets, there was things around development, but my job was to lead the research transformation.
So when you say uplift, does this mean that people that participate in this 20 weeks come back to their agency afterwards with they've gone through some professional development?
Yeah, so the goal is for them to go back to their home agencies or departments and actually continue the momentum. So we learn a lot about that process. That's a whole talk in its own right about how do you build momentum and continue momentum when you're taking the team out of their context and out of their daily working life. So they were embedded into our agency for that 20 weeks where we create the space for them to do that. We had the walls, we had the Post-it notes, we had the equipment that we could take them out. It was very different when they went home. So we learn a lot about that process and we iterate through our services as a result. But for them, it's about how do we enable those kind of processes and systems for them to learn these things and to take it home and keep going with it. So, for example, they had somebody whose job was something to shadow me and to actually pick up the research skill set so they could try to take that back home and do a bit more of a deeper dive in research.
So it seems like there's two sort of I'm sure there's multiple objectives, but it seems like one objective is go through this 20 weeks in order to launch something. In this case, this sort of small, web questionnaire that you created. I think it's on the web.
Yeah. It's
so the project has an objective and an outcome, but the objective for this whole engagement is to uplift the skills so that people can keep going afterwards.
Yeah.
And are those two objectives in harmony when you do a program like this?
That's a really good question. And that's part of our learnings from this, about what is the measure of success when we're talking about increasing kind of skill sets, whether in the research space or the other kind of what we call the specialty skill sets. How do we be clear about what that measurement was? I think part of my learning personally going through that was that wasn't probably quite as clear back then. So we had some tension at times where the team needs to show something to deliver. And then at the same time, I'm trying to uplift the research capability to show the rigor, to show how do we work in these ways. Now, our sprint cycles were only a week at a time. It was very, very fast. And you're taking people through what feels like a very uncomfortable process. And it's uncomfortable. They're getting challenged every single day. And our job is to help them through and navigate through that process. So, yeah, it creates tension. But as I said, we have iterated as a result of going through those programs to work out how do we now better serve our customers, which are the other government agencies.
Mm-hmm. And so, where, if we were to sort of draw an org chart in there, I don't know, maybe it's not an org chart for the government, where does DTA reside within the structure of Australian government?
Yeah, we have an interesting function. So we are not a delivery arm, nor we touch on policy work, but we sit under the Prime Minister and Cabinet kind of function. So what that means is we are this centralised agency. It is a bit different. I think maybe the closest equivalent might be the 18F-ish in the US, a little bit of GDS in the UK. I'm not sure what the Canadian version would be, but we have a little bit of that kind of function where it's not tied into any particular agency, because our job is to work across government agencies. But that brings its own challenges particularly around the research practices, how we'll come back to this at some point about how we manage our knowledge across government when there's a lot of research is happening across many, many agencies. So we've got this uplift function, but as my role as head of research, I'm also interested in how we manage those other functions within government as well that relates to research and supporting the research practice.
Sorry, so other functions? What do you mean?
Yeah, so at the moment, for example, I help teams do a lot of recruitment, whether it's internally within our organisation or other government agencies. So they reach out and go, Ruth, we need to hire a researcher. We're not quite sure what to look for. Can you help? So it's about reaching out. How do we help them craft how do we help them find the right fit of people? So are they doing a discovery piece? Are they doing just a lot of very heavy product work that it's just iterating just their product day to day and trying to work out what is it that they actually need and how does that work and what kind of researcher would they need? So helping them find that right fit, because we don't have a pool of people. We're a very small agency, so we just can't pop out and just embed into teams.
Right.
We did that before in the past. It doesn't scale for us. So now we're working how we support those functions. Other things that we're also looking at is how do we manage the knowledge that we build as government around our citizens. We have so much research and we spend a lot of money as government looking at our citizens' experience, their interaction with government, but it's often done in those individual organisations. So they might have lots of data internally, but what happens when we start needing to look at it between those touch points, between those different agencies? How does research work in those spaces in between? Because people are having a very agency-focused view of their citizens.
Yeah. So
one of our functions is actually looking at how we provide a more holistic lens across government to show that when a citizen engages with government, it's not just a department at a time, but it's actually a range of organisations, whether it's government, private sector, friends, networks, whatever it is, how we show that relationship and the context of people's lives. So it's bigger than just one particular service or element of a service.
Are there aspects of how government is structured? I don't know whether that's regulatory or funding or, are there any, you're talking, because every big organization has sort of siloed research and siloed data and doesn't treat the user experience as coming across all those things. I think that's common and, above a certain size, but I'm wondering, are there sort of any interesting compounding factors in the way that government works that maybe changes that, how you even try to address those problems?
Yeah, it's a really good point because different government agencies have different rules around data collection and different legislation around how much data and what data you collect. There's often discussion about, as user researchers, the kind of data we collect may not necessarily be the same kind of data that the legislation demands that we collect a bunch of other things around that service. So it's often this tension of going, well, we're here to understand about our citizens. How do we collect data that people might go, the consent has only allowed it to be shared within that particular department. So we start hitting up against issues around consent, and do we start looking at broader consent around all of government, or is it mostly just federal government, or is it just between portfolios of government? We haven't nutted out that issue yet. It's a challenge that we're working on right now, because consent is such a big problem space for us. Like, we want to do research that's ethical and safe, and it's really challenging when you've got multiple agencies who are funded separately. It's just, back in the private sector days, I'll come and I'll work for one organisation at a time. This feels like we're just up the whole scale of the problem, because now we're taking it across multiple agencies who may not necessarily want to share or be as comfortable sharing what they have for a number of reasons, whether it feels reputational risk, because we deal a lot as risk as government. It's always focused about risk. People go, what happens if people find out people said that about our service? We don't want people to know that people said that about our service. So you get those kinds of complicated...
so there's a risk to the agency if the feedback or any kind of user data that's critical of that agency, if that becomes public, if you're a civil servant, then that you don't want that.
There's some mindsets that believe that creates they call it reputational risk for government. Okay. So it's one of the challenges heading up research is how do we deal with that kind of mindset, and how do we shift some of that thinking as well. So a lot of framing I've been using a lot more recently is about, this is about risk reduction and about increasing your certainty in the decisions we're making, whether it's policy or your product or your features, whatever scale we're talking about. Research helps you with that decision making. We're not something that you just do on the side and you just throw over. It actually becomes part of your decision-making processes and one of your many inputs. Because at the end of the day, we understand that people have a lot of pressures and they're making decisions about why they release certain things, whether it's a policy or a government service. But how do we help them do those things a bit better? And so that framing around risk reduction or, reducing risk, increasing certainty speaks the language of some people.
That also sounds like private sector product development, where the consequences are different. It's not just about finances, it's about other. I'm gathering that in your situation, there's other consequences besides, profit of the organization in the commercial sector. But so like you said, reputational risk is like a very tangible thing that people are kind of operating around. And
we also have another challenge that government, we work in a 4-year cycle over here in Australia. So the cycles of government, if there's a different change of government happening, the agendas may change as well. And that would change the focus of your research. When you're trying to be a bit more strategic with research, you can change that function or not. We have that additional level to think of. So although at one hand you could go, we still need to understand our users, our citizens, no matter what government's in power, we still have we're still part of our function and role as a researcher to keep that understanding going, keep developing that deep understanding. But the stuff it aligns to and the strategic decision making does change, and that's always an interesting factor. I think working in government is what actually made me. It's one of the things that made me join, actually leave private sector and come here, was the complexity of all these kind of nitty gritty things that looks simple on the outside, but it's actually really complex and really messy, and I just love that.
Yeah, what do you love about that? That sounds like something that some people might run away from, but you're drawn to it.
Because it's hard. It's really, really hard. Because I've been a consultant for, 7, 8, for many years, and I enjoyed that breadth of consulting. But what I find as a consultant, we go in, we help people do a certain thing. You get that joy of that seeing something happening quite tangibly. But I reached a point in my career where I wanted to see that really affect change in a much greater scale and affect it in a much longer kind of time frame as well. So what I was going to point as a consultant where you do things and affects a particular project or a program. But I actually want to start looking at how do we affect whole-scale change in government? How do we start shifting that mindset? And it was hard to do it as a consultant. So I thought the only way I could maybe try doing it is to join the public service. So about 2.5 years ago, I left the private sector and I've come in to try to do this with a bunch of other really smart people across all levels of government, trying to look at how we do this transformation. And it's hard. And I like that because you're in for the long haul. You're in for this massive change. It's not easy. And we're doing this kind of research that's really, you're starting to look at behaviour and organisational and government government level change. And it's complex and fun. Exhausting, but fun.
So you're describing in the consulting world, there's moments or points in the process where you draw satisfaction or some sense of reward from.
Yeah.
And now you're in this much more complex situation. It's hard. I'm sort of inferring things take time. What rewards do you identify yourself that, whether it's milestones or successes, like what keeps you going in a very hard endeavor that you've chosen?
This, for me, is about the empowering of others. Because, one thing you said a lot earlier was about that we help people. Like, we like to help people. That's why we do the role that we do. And for me, this is for how do we help it at scale? Government has been doing things for a very long time, and it's very, very smart people in government. They're often bogged down in the structures of government, the bureaucracy, that sometimes doesn't enable the kind of stuff that these smart people are working on. So what gives me satisfaction is being able to help some of that transformation, to help others, empower them to do this stuff better. And the satisfaction I get is when somebody has that kind of mindset shift and they're taking this stuff back home, or they're coming back to me later and go, Ruth, it's been a year since I've seen you, but here's what I've done. And they themselves have gone back and been this change agent for not just research, but for just human-centered, good human-centered thinking. And it's great when you see that kind of stuff happen. So helping others to do this stuff better.
Yeah, you said the long haul, and it makes me think, as someone who is a consultant, you're done. You're not there to get that feedback or see the consequences, or you have to kind of find your way back in to say, hey, what happened a year later? So if you're, these are longer term working relationships that you have, you're able to hear from those people and see kind of some of what's happening.
Yeah.
Maybe we can talk about the head of user research role. Like, when did that come about? How did it come about?
Yeah, so head of research role, I've been doing that for about a year. About maybe 2 years now. We had a previous head of, it was actually service design and research, Lisa Rackard, who you would know. When she left, they actually split that role up to two. And her role was a executive level role, but they ended up splitting up the role and taking it down a level, it was an interesting organizational change, I think, into a head of service design and head of research. We've also have head of content strategy and head of interaction design, and are my equivalents. So my role involves helping my agency and across government to really better the practice of research. So I'm finding I'm doing a lot. I don't do as much research anymore nowadays. My role is really more an enabling function. So part of that is looking at how do we bring in the right people into the teams. When they're here, how do we help mentor them? So part of my role is I catch up with a lot of the researchers, checking how they're going. I'm connecting them to other researchers as well in our communities, and also trying to look at how we put together much more, how we lift the conversation around research. So part of my role is actually around that strategic aspect of research. How do we do it better? How do we help enable the broader decision-making of government? We're also starting to see a shift towards more policy side. So rather than just product and services, up into policy land where, a policy can trigger many, many services and products. So that's really fascinating as well. And I'm really enjoying that kind of aspect as well. The other parts of the role is really, so we look after a guild. So I don't know, I've heard other organisations have this structure too. So our researchers who come into our organisation are embedded into product teams. But we have a guild that then unites all of those researchers and those interested in research to come together once a fortnight and actually share the knowledge. So it could be, for example, I'll be going back and doing a sharing of what I might learn at a conference. Somebody might share about something happening on their project, a problem that they're having. How do we solve it together? So the guild is almost like a tribe that cuts across our organisation, no matter what team you're from, and it unites us as a practice. And that's how I work through that kind of process to enable the better uplift of our practice. And externally, my job is to advocate for the research role. So I often get called in to talk to other executives about what is this research thing? Don't we do this stuff? Haven't we been doing this stuff for years? Answering those kind of questions, work out how it helps them from a strategic perspective, how it helps them in their decision making, and also just help our staff connect better and just do the craft better.
So you just said before how one of the things you're doing is helping agencies hire into that agency as opposed to into DTA, hire researchers directly into those agencies. Are those, and then you're talking now about sort of maintaining connections with researchers through sort of formal and informal methods. I'm just trying to understand, is that within DTA only, or is there engagement with these sort of other agency researchers, I guess I'd call them?
Yeah, the supporting through the Guild is a DTA only thing that we do, or anybody that comes into DTA on a short-term project, we connect them up into the Guild so we can support them that way. But for the broader government, we actually got a Google mailing list. It's called a Service Design and User Research mailing list, covers both service design and research, and we support people through that. But it's not just us supporting, because we're a facilitator, so our job is to connect others to each other, because we've got amazing people out in government. And if they connect and peer, we learn from each other. That's a really good thing. We're not the be all end all. We're that connecting function. I think some use were brokering. We help broker relationships as well. Otherwise, it can come across as, oh, does it mean everything has to go through DTA, or do we have to be involved in all this stuff? No, because it's about enabling others and empowering others to connect and keep growing together.
So there might be a researcher in one agency that you know, and another researcher at another agency that you also know, but they don't know each other. And if there's something going on, you might say, oh, this is the researcher you should talk to.
Yeah, so if someone say they're just trying out a particular technique for the first time, I go, oh, so-and-so from here has actually done it before. Have a chat to them how they do it, and because they will have some good learnings in the government context of what worked, what didn't work, and they will just help speed you up when you're trying to do this yourself.
So in DTA itself, you listed a bunch of different functions that you have kind of peers leading. I'm sort of wondering how the team sizes vary, or I don't know if the team is the right word, but sort of the number of people maybe in each of those functions.
Yeah, so at the moment we've got, I think we've got around 13 researchers, but a number varies significantly across the DTA depending on the projects that we're supporting at the time. And also doesn't include the projects that we support that belongs to other agencies. So that number scales. At one point I was working on one project that had 18 researchers, and that was just within the one project. So that was a good question there about scaling and processes and ethics and all of that. But the number changes. And what's interesting is that the recruitment is done by the product owner, and we provide a supporting function to help them get the right fit, but it's done by the products. The person comes, they join the product team, so they don't belong to my team of researchers. It's more of a virtual kind of team. That makes sense. It's where the guild/tribe comes in.
Right.
In those product teams, they usually range between the kind of 6-10 kind of sizing, and there's usually a dedicated research function in there. Not all teams can have one, because as government we often have budget constraints, so we have people who do research who are not necessarily researchers, but we try to encourage that specialisms, whether it's researcher or service designer or interaction designer, because they bring a depth and they're upskilling people in their team as they're doing it too.
So someone could be hired into DTA as a researcher, but the thing they're spending their time on is a project team.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Although I try to steal some time to work on our community, our practice-related things. So one of the things at the moment is we're reiterating through our processes and policies at the moment. So through guilds, we use the guild as a bit of a working spot as well. We come together one hour a fortnight, and we use it to work out what we want to tackle next and how to improve this particular process. So I try to steal time that way from those teams to enable our better practices.
What's the for Australian government employees? What's the geographically dispersed are they, if at all? Yeah, so DTA,
because we're so small, we're based mostly in Canberra, which is the capital of Australia, and very small. I think we're near about 400,000 people that lives in Canberra. Our other office is Sydney, which is even smaller. But what makes it interesting when you have that kind of diversity in spaces is that other agencies are even bigger than us, and they have many more people scattered around Australia. But the challenge, I think, it comes to research is recruiting, finding strong talent. In Canberra can be challenging as well. And often I love Canberra, but lots of people, there's always jokes about Canberra. People find it's weird that it's too cold because it's, you can snow, winter. It's cold in Canberra, and it's hot in summer. It's small, we're inland. People have these stereotypes about it being a government town. So there's all these stereotypes around Canberra being a boring place. It's actually not. It's actually a beautiful place. And I love it. But recruitment becomes really challenging. Like, how do you encourage people to leave their beautiful cities of Melbourne, Sydney and come spend some time working for government. So part of it's trying to shift the conversation around, well, are we working on how we work on more meaningful work instead, and shifting the conversation around that. Yeah, so it's I think I always joked with Lisa before about, do we need to have a recruitment video to show people, hey, it's great, come work in Canberra. But it does change the way then on recruitment and how we uplift capability within existing skill sets as well.
Can we go back to something you were saying about policy? I want to just understand maybe the mechanics of that more. So I understand that policy is set by parts of the government, and then that, as you said, that impacts the products that are being created. But you were describing maybe a different cycle, I think, or a different stroke in that cycle where the work that you're doing, I don't know if it's correct to say it's impacting policy, or what's the dynamic there, I guess is really my question.
So there's been a shift, more recent shift in government. I think you'll see that globally, is in global governments as well, about how we shift this more human-centered thinking and lenses over to policy lens. So traditionally in policy, they do a lot of research. When you create a policy, they go out, they do big-scale studies. There's certain methodologies for policy research. But part of what we're trying to help is how do we get the policy folks who are creating this policy actually out in the field, actually talking to the people who are impacted by this policy, and actually going out into the communities will be impacted down the track by this, and actually understand that context. So some policy people do that already, but it's not necessarily the norm. So we're trying to work out how we shift some of that thinking, and that's part of my kind of focus at the moment, is how we start working towards that lens. And it's really interesting because, people have been doing policy creation for years. It's not a new thing. Research for them is not a new thing, but the way we do our kind of research is actually new for them. And trying to help people go, actually, this stuff that we do is not just a digital thing. There's a bit of perception that, this kind of research is digital products, right? And you go, actually, no, we can actually apply it across a range of things, because it's really about understanding people, understanding what is it like, to whether it's interacting with government or whatever it is. What does a day in the life of someone look like in this space? Especially as government, we're serving such a diverse range of people, from our Indigenous communities to those that are very disadvantaged, to those that might be on the other end of the scale as well, all the way to large-scale businesses and small. It's such an amazing, diverse set of users. So how do we kind of work together to shift that thinking? It's a good challenge, and one that I think would take time as well.
It seems very analogous to working with those agencies and your phrase of uplifting their skills. Those product people are starting at a different place than your policy people are, but it sounds like it's the same thing. We want to help you sort of understand the benefit of going out to the communities and seeing what's going on. Because
as I mentioned earlier, a lot of government. I remember starting government 17 years ago, working on mainframe systems, and our work involved doing usability testing. Like you go in and you see people using your thing. So research from that aspect is not new, but I think the more generous style and exploratory style of research is new, or new work for government now, because it's been happening for the last few years. So seeing that shift has been really interesting to say, how do we help you do more of that style of research as well? And they're all very valuable. And the stuff you're doing before usability testing is great, and it's got a purpose, but how do we shift that conversation to talk about, are we actually solving the right problems? I think that comes under the guise at the moment a lot under innovation labs and design thinking. But in the end of the day, for me, it's about the fundamentals of who are these people we're designing for, what problems are we trying to solve, and how do we understand the needs deeply, how we get there. There'll be a range of methods, how we help people work out what that combination of methods are.
I mean, we talk about research methods. That's often about, how do we get this data from these users we're trying to understand? But, your emphasis seems very strongly on how do we engage the different people that work in government to learn that and do that and use it. And it sounds like the word methods to me would encompass what you're doing there as well.
Yeah, methods, approaches. It is. I mean, it's one of those things that words, he said, but words have meaning and words are powerful. But even trying to understand, even within government, right, when we talk about research, we talk about methods, people immediately go, well, what are we talking about? Are we talking about market research? We do a lot of that in government. Is that what you mean? Or is it just this design thinking thing, which is also, a big buzzword? Or is it this agile thing? So it's just, for me, it's like, well, being clear, what's the outcome we're trying to achieve as government? And I use the word methods, but it really is about that focus of we know we have an outcome. How do we best meet that? And and make sure we're doing something that's good for our users, so it doesn't disadvantage them, but hopefully improves their lives as well.
It'd be great to talk a little about, what your just trajectory was through your education and your professional work that kind of led you on the path. We talked a little bit about the consulting work before government, but it'd be great to just go back a little to talk about, sort of as you, where did you start to see this path that you've been on kind of come?
I actually totally by accident fell into it. I started off as a business analyst designing mainframe screens. So that was over 17 years ago, my first kind of proper design kind of job. I had no idea about mainframes at that time. I was like, what is this thing, this beast of a thing? It was just by the luck of the draw. I happened to be sitting next to a team that was the very first user-centered design team in government, in Australian government. So I would hear them. They go out, they do these things, they come back and they'll share these stories about the people that they were meeting and the kind of feedback they had about products they were testing. I was like, what are they doing? This stuff is really interesting. So being a curious person, I stuck my head up over the fence and then asked them, what is it that you're doing? So they told me about this user-centered design stuff. I never covered that in my uni degree. Like we covered it all about systems gathering, requirements gathering, all these different methodologies that you do to do that. Never once heard about this human-centered stuff before. So by accident, I heard that and I just asked, can I join the team? And I thought, what's the worst you can say? No. And then I'll just keep doing what I'm doing and keep trying to find a way. So I asked and I joined that team. And so I had my grounding by learning on the job. So starting government 17 years ago, just learning about what this user-centered design stuff was, really loved it so much, and then went back to uni to try to get a master's in human factors back in the day. So
What was your first degree in?
My first degree was information technology and systems, so very, very IT driven. Mm-hmm. So I come from that kind of that kind of analytic lens is where I came from. But yeah, I think but doing more of this stuff, I just realized I love research. But it was a gradual thing because I didn't know that such a job existed. Now, it could be a reflection of Australia at the time because 17 years ago, the whole user-centered design movement was starting to happen. Companies were getting set up to do this kind of space. Government agencies were thinking about this stuff and doing usability testing. That's what UCD was at the time. So that was my first foray into this field. From there, and I think like many other people in Australia, we were generalists. We came from UCD to a UX generalist. We did everything, including research, prototyping, everything. But I found soon after, I quickly realized that research was my passion. I just want to keep doing more of this stuff. I think I'm really interested in what people do and say and think and why do they do certain things. And that's fascinating. So over the next 17 years, I ended up leaving government and then going out into consulting. I was headhunted to come and do this work, and it was great. So I did that and was working in private sector for quite a while and had this broad range of experiences. And then from there, that's when I decided, okay, I've been doing this stuff for a while. I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying being a principal and helping others be better at the consulting craft. But that's when the thing came back to then, how do I do this in a longer term, impactful thing around government? Because that's where I live. And I'm really passionate to see how we improve government. And there's just so much interesting work happening at space. So that's when I made the leap back. So I started off at DTA as one of the lead senior researchers that they had. And then when Lisa left and took over and became head of research.
When we think about the time that you were consulting, as someone who, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to something else. You started to talk about going back to uni for as a human factors.
Yeah, back in the day, there's human factors. Yes. But we didn't have all the amazing design degrees we have now.
Right.
Back then, it was, that was the closest thing I could find because I wanted to improve. I just want to broaden my skill set in this kind of human-centered design space, and the only thing we had at the time was human factors. So I was doing that remotely. I was also one of the first few students who was doing remote uni work. They never had that before. It was challenging, and I got to work with and learn with a bunch of people who were designing airplanes and aircrafts and hospital systems. And when I had to introduce myself, I was like, I work for government, I design systems, digital systems. It was very jarring for me to go, wow, these people are doing stuff that this massive design things that if you get it wrong, it falls out the sky or people die. And I was just designing online systems. But it was such a good grounding for me because human factors really about that processing, that cognition. It really drew upon the School of Psychology and the sciences as well from this particular course that I was doing.
Was there ever a point at which you started to identify yourself as a researcher specifically?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a hard one to answer because in Australia most people have mostly been generalists. That's how it's just evolved. And you had to be in the consulting world to survive because and I used to get really jealous overseas, and I will see the kind of work you're doing. Go, oh, you can be a specialist in this. But in Australia, we just weren't quite there as a country. We didn't have the maturity to say I am a researcher. So I call myself just a UX person for a long time, but research is my passion, and I always seeked projects where I was doing that kind of work, where it's research, and help enable that in our clients and in our practice. Yes, I did. I think it just evolved. I'm not even sure when I just started calling myself that kind of thing. It was just something that I just did.
So your first job that you came into DTA with, though, you had researcher was in your title.
Yeah.
I guess, and not to conflate the way we identify ourselves with what our job title is, but that's a point where you went from generalist to specialist. Is that right?
Oh, if you're talking about titles, probably yes, because previously my title was principal consultant, UX consultant, and part of my job was, that although most of my work I was doing was pretty much research, but it was research work. That's just what I like, and so I'll get that, I'll take that, I'll do that kind of work. But that wouldn't necessarily go down well with the clients. They just didn't know. They just weren't ready for that in Australia. So they were more familiar with UX. We need to improve our experience, and however you get there, we'll help them get that out. Help them get that outcome. So although probably 90% of my work was research. The other part of it was actually supporting, probably less than that, because I was actually supporting the practices as well. As principal, my job was to make sure the quality of all the work coming through was also good. I was doing a lot of that kind of stuff, that kind of leadership role. It was my other half of my job before I left consulting. So, I think the DTA was the first time I actually just used the title and to the exclusion of everything else.
So, one of the points you were making earlier was about just, the challenge of recruiting, I guess in Canberra specifically, and maybe in government as part of that. But how did you get recruited to rejoin government? So
I was actually working at the former DTA, or DTO, as a consultant, doing research work for them, because it's the first time they were going through these ways of working. We were doing a discovery, alpha, beta, live, and they needed people who had experience doing research, who could help lead that process and to help facilitate that process. And they were also recruiting for other specialists. So I was one of the many specialists that was brought on because they had to scale really quickly, and trying to build that capability within weeks was not going to happen. So they had to find it externally. So I was one of those many externals that were brought in. When I came in, I saw these ways of working, gone, wow, I didn't know we could do that in government, because it is a bit of stereotype. People think about government as very, very slow-moving beasts, that you can't do a lot of things. But the reality is about how do we frame it, and how do we talk the language of the people who are decision makers to help bring about these change. So for me, seeing that, I was like, I want to be part of this kind of stuff. This what feels like a bit of like a startup. Doing all these ways. It's like I found a home. So seeing that was how I then made a leap. So DTA then or DTO at that time they kept asking, can you come on board? If you like doing this stuff, you like government, come join. So I took a while to think about it, quite a while, and then made the leap, because it is a big leap. It is, to leave what is a very interesting job as a consultant. You're helping so many different clients. You're having so many different problem spaces. One day you could be working for an airline, next one for a bank, next one for a not-for-profit. That's really, really interesting, and I like that. But there was this need. I wanted to be part of that movement as well. To transform the way we do things as government.
You've made this point a couple of times that even though the D in DTA is digital, that the work, the output, the outcomes don't have to be digital. Do you have any examples where that's kind of how it's gone? Yeah,
so there was this great project a few years ago done within DTA. It's called Medicare. Medicare is our kind of health system where if you're a citizen, you get access to a range of health services. It's covered by the government. So one of the services looking at was having a baby. So in Australia, you have a baby. You have to register the baby for a Medicare card. There's a whole range of process around the registration. And as someone who's gone through it myself in the last 2 years, it's actually quite a tricky time frame, because you're exhausted from delivering this amazing little thing. You've got a million things going through your mind, and then you've got all these forms you have to fill fill in. And sometimes that involves, because of identity things, you have to go into offices with a newborn. It's just hard. It's hard. And I've particularly emphasized now that I have a little one myself. So this particular project is looking at how do we make that process easier. Now, what was interesting was that the team at Gordon, I think they were thinking, maybe we'll just digitize the form. Maybe that's what we mean when we talk about digital transformation. That might be the easiest way we can deliver something quickly. But what they soon found out, and they had a really awesome service designer called Mira who joined the team. She worked with them, and she actually suggested they bring in a lawyer, because they kept hitting up against issues like, oh, well, of course, we'll just digitize the form. What else would we do? But when they went out doing the research, they were finding out that a lot of the stuff we were asking for as government, we really have, and the hospitals have, because when you give birth, you're giving a bunch of details over. So they actually went out, did a bunch of research out in hospitals. And what they ended up doing was actually deciding, you know what, we don't actually need something. We don't actually need a form, or we don't actually need a digital thing that you have, like an app or a form or a website to fill in. What happens if we even just remove that process and just assume that if we're having a baby, we get consent, we can just issue the card. So they're exploring this what might we kind of situations. And it was radical. People go, oh, no, you can't do that. But when the lawyer joined the team, there were lawyers going, actually, you know what, we can actually make this work. So the trial was actually in one of the hospitals up in the Gold Coast, was actually looking at what happens if you seek consent from the parents at the time of the birth. They really filled in a bunch of information to the hospital about the birth of the baby. What happens if we use that and create and issue the Medicare card? So something had gone from taking weeks and weeks because you have to go in, see multiple people, get things signed in, had gone down from that to only a few days. And it was amazing, because you've now gone from filling in something to not even having a thing at all, and a service, the stuff just appeared in your letterbox. For me, that was a very great example of transformation happening, where you don't have to have a particular physical digital thing. And and it's good to see what they did with it.
Are there things outside the professional realm, like outside your work at DTA, where your skills, the things that that you have passion for, and the things that you are just so great at, is there anything that you do outside where those things manifest in other forms?
Other forms. So Canberra is a very small place, and I love community. So things I do that's not research related, but it comes down to people. I'm involved a lot in organising community events around things like TEDx Canberra. So I was involved in that for about 5 years, about bringing and helping facilitate the amount of smart people that we have, and for others to learn from that. I really enjoyed that aspect, and that comes through my job as well. I really love connecting people and seeing them grow, and because my intent is if you can grow and be a million times better than what I can ever be, that is an awesome outcome. Always hire people that are smarter than you. You want to encourage that growth. So for me, that stuff that manifests outside of my job is to do with things like that, things with like I'm not sure about bar camp back in the days, something called GovHack. I used to be involved very early in the days where we look at open government data. How do we help people mash that up into interesting things? All those little stuff like that is what it's all, again, about connecting community and people. Yeah, and something else I do that's not even related is I love making. So my hubby and I, we're both makers. We like crafting things. So I make science-themed jewellery for fun as well on the side, using our lasers and 3D printers. And for me, it's more about that process of designing something that's very, very tangible, and you're prototyping that thing and you're wearing it and you're seeing people use it as well. And it's very interesting. So although it's not necessarily a pure research, it's not a research thing. Yeah. It's a fun thing, because you are trying to use a creative side of your brain in a very different way, in a much more tangible way. So is
that the connection to the creative, the different way of expressing that creativity?
Yeah, and I find I'm just doing research on a very small scale, right? Getting people to wear my stuff in and see how it works. It's just very, very small scale stuff to see. But you learn a lot about people's behaviours, about, when they say things like, oh, Ruth, can you make that in these colours? Because we think, I reckon people buy that. And what people say they want, what they actually end up doing. Yeah. We talk about that all the time, but to see it in action with your own products is very interesting, because you'll make stuff and then you go, because people ask for it, right? So let's just try it, see what happens. If there's not a need for it, you just blatantly see it sit there. So just little things like that, just really tiny stuff that we talk about in our practice that manifests in this way is just interesting.
Can you describe one of your pieces?
Yeah, so one of the things that we do is looking at data. We look at data data. So my hubby actually takes the data from looking at the weather data for cities in Australia. So the Bureau of Meteorology here has like about 100 plus years of weather data. So we take that and actually visualize it into a wearable piece. Unfortunately, I'm not wearing one today. I'm wearing a serotonin molecule today, which is happiness. So we take that and then actually model it into a bit of a big jewelry piece, statement piece, and then laser cut it. And that's meant to show, just data visualization. How do we make science interesting and communicate these things in different ways? It's not just PowerPoint or a presentation or a survey, but actually a very tangible way of understanding data. So I'm interested in also that crossover between when we talk about research, the data, and the data sciences folks. So I just love geeking out over some of the data stuff and go, hey, maybe we could find other just weird, wonderful ways to display this that may not have any actual use to researchers, but it's just geeky and fun.
What do you think people who purchase your jewelry, because like so much of our work is the people that make something have a model of it and the people that use it have a model of it. And sometimes our job is to just try to, articulate that delta, right? So you're describing kind of what you're putting into these pieces and even just the geeky pleasure of it. But for someone that buys one and wears something that you made, what's their interpretation or their narrative of what it is or what it means?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Yeah, people come up and they identify as a fellow science geek, science nerd. It's fascinating seeing that and going, is that a serotonin molecule? I'm like, it is. And then we have a conversation about science and about what makes them interested in science. And I use that kind of a talking point to work out how do they get into this field, or they're not in the science field. How do they actually trigger? It's a good way to practice research questions, actually. But it's just fascinating seeing that kind of shared, I think that having that shared platform or love of a particular field, whether in this case science.
Yeah. And
that's what connects people, and they feel like, they're part of this group of people who just love these kind of geeky things.
There's something, I don't know, secret about it that someone who gets it's going to get it when they see it, and somebody else is just going to not recognize that.
I think, it's funny. It's not a secret club, but it is that recognition that somebody else enjoys this thing, whether it's, people have that with music or, with, whether it's knitting or whatever their particular passion is. When you connect on that kind of level, it's just so interesting. Then you start hearing their stories about how they're either buying it for their daughter because their daughter has started doing this thing about, out in Antarctica, and you just go, wow, just the stories you hear. And I think that's when it comes to my research. I just love hearing people's stories as well. And you hear all these fascinating things that people tell you when you're buying jewelry, because it's just conversation starter.
Yeah, and you're connecting on something. You're right. It's not secret. Secret is about being hidden. This is just that connection around something about the recognition. That's a better way of putting it, to get those stories. That's really, really wonderful. Is there anything else that we should cover in this conversation?
I think we had a good range of discussion.
I think so too. Well, thank you so much. It's been really great to chat with you. Thanks for sharing so much great stuff.
That was really fun. Thank you very much for your help, for your time.
All right. That's the wrap on another episode. Subscribe to Dollars to Donuts wherever you get podcasts. If you're using Apple Podcasts, how about giving the podcast a rating and even a short review? This helps other people find out about the podcast. Portugal.com/podcast has transcripts, show notes, and all of the episodes. Follow the podcast on Twitter and buy my books, Interviewing Users and Doorbells, Danger, and Dead Batteries from Rosenfeld Media or Amazon. Our theme music is by Bruce Todd.